Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 6. Module 6, the last of the course, Planning for Instruction and Assessment in Dual Language and Bilingual Education. I'll be your host today, and this lecture is primarily, if not entirely, about assessment, because the readings you've done have been about curriculum and instruction. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of a basic framework for thinking about literacy, and then expand that framework into 3 different ways for thinking about bilingualism and biliteracy, and then talk about what those frameworks mean for assessment, the types of assessments that can be done. And so your job, as you sort of listen through and stare at some of the things on the PowerPoint, is to think about your own assessment practices in classrooms, your assessment practices at the district level or at the school level, what languages they're in, and what, if they are in more than one language, or if they try to tap more than one language, which framework do they apply to? So I will share my screen with you all. And we'll start. So again, this is Module 6. The objectives here are y'all demonstrate understanding of the broad expectations of curriculum and instruction in dual language immersion schools and classrooms. That's the readings that you've done. And then for the purposes of this lecture, issues of assessment with bilingual children at the classroom, district, and state level. So that's where you want to be thinking about the applications of some of this content. So to start with the nucleus model for literacy assessment. This is in some circles called the simple view of reading. Now, reading is not a simple thing. It's a very complex thing. But it's at the nucleus of reading, you have sort of 2 things going on. One, you look at the bottom on the left there, you have word recognition. You have to be able to read the words. And you remember in Module 3, we talked about graphization and what that means in terms of taking a language and giving it a written form. Well, you do that in order for people to be able to recognize the words that are written down that are part of the language. And so one huge part of literacy is this idea of word recognition, or what's also called orthographic knowledge. Because knowing how the orthography works is critically important, not only for reading, but also for writing, because you need to be able to spell, whether you're typing or handwriting. So word recognition is one aspect of skilled reading. The other is language proficiency, what's in the simple view is called language comprehension, and that is a very complex phenomenon, how proficient we are in a language. That encompasses background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, language structures, your ability to reason verbally, what you know about literacy, concepts of print, things of that nature. These 2 things, word recognition and language comprehension, they go together. You can't read if either of those is equal to 0. You think of it as a multiplicative relationship. If word recognition is 0, it doesn't matter how great a language comprehender you are, your reading comprehension will be 0. You won't be able to write either. Similarly, you might be the best word reader in the world, but if you don't speak the language, then your language comprehension is 0, but your word recognition could be perfect. It doesn't matter. I often use an example I could teach a monolingual English speaker to very easily decode Spanish, such that in a month or so, they could probably read Don Quixote out loud to a native Spanish speaker who would understand them, but they would not comprehend a word they were reading because they don't speak Spanish. So those are the two major dimensions for thinking about literacy assessment. And developmentally, you can see these arrows pointing toward the sort of the weaving of the 2 strands of the rope. Word recognition for kids, once they start learning how to read in kindergarten and 1st grade, it becomes increasingly automatic. That is, over time, by 3rd grade, 4th grade, barring atypical development, kids become reasonably good word readers. Language comprehension, by contrast, over time, needs to become increasingly strategic, because the language of texts gets increasingly difficult. So kids are more likely to encounter words and structures and background knowledge that they don't already possess as they get older. So they need that word recognition to be intact so they can focus more strategy development and strategy application to the linguistic comprehension. And as those two things work together, that results in skilled reading, skilled writing, and is also subject to a number of other sort of external factors, sort of socioeconomic status, language background, motivation and engagement, all sorts of things impinge on this. But the idea is that this simple view is at the nucleus of literacy. So now defining bilingualism for assessment. So a sort of famous bilingual researcher named Francois Grosjean has a very simple definition of bilingualism, and that is speaking 2 or more languages on a daily basis. So any student in a dual language program, whether they speak English at home or Portuguese or Spanish or Mandarin, any student who's in a dual language program is going to be considered bilingual for the purposes of this definition. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. So 3 frameworks for assessment, for thinking about bilingualism and literacy. So for each of these frameworks, I'm going to give you a brief description of it, so it's got a theoretical underpinning. 2, questions you can ask with assessments. What kind of questions can you ask and answer via assessment? And then talk about the problems that they have. They are different, the problems that each of these frameworks present. All assessment presents problems, as I'm sure everyone listening knows. So that's how this presentation will work. So the first framework is probably the one we're all most familiar with and see at play most often, and that's called the 2 monolinguals framework. And that is this idea that, you know, monolingual people have one well-filled language balloon in their head. Monolinguals only speak 1 language. So that's the only language in there that's being used or that is processing information cognitively. But bilinguals, just like monolinguals, have 2 language balloons in their head. They're just less well-filled because the bilingual has to sort of navigate going back and forth between them, and as a result, the exposures aren't as robust as they would be were they in only 1 language. And so you see this sort of these 2 bubbles inside this strange picture of a head. First language ability, second language ability. That's the 2 monolinguals framework. There are 2 separate language entities. There are 2 language structures in the brain. And so we see this playing out quite a bit. So most common assessment formats take the 2 monolinguals framework. So here's, this is results from a single student in 1st grade having been assessed in fall of 2014 on 4 different dimensions of language and literacy. So at the bottom you see picture vocabulary, verbal analogies, letter word ID, which is word reading, and passage comprehension, which is reading comprehension. So picture vocabulary is how many words do you know? Verbal analogies is being able to complete analogies, up is to down as left is to right. Letter word ID is being able to read lists of real words, and passage comprehension is being able to comprehend what you read. So this particular student is treated as 2 monolinguals in 1 brain. These are on the left-hand side on the y-axis. There are percentile rankings. So this particular student is average in English in vocabulary knowledge, but very low in Spanish vocabulary knowledge. Similar profile for verbal analogies. However, interestingly, a reverse profile in word reading, and similar performance in passage comprehension. In your groups, you might take a moment, pause this video, and discuss why that might be. How could it be that a student be relatively strong in English vocabulary and verbal reasoning, and weak in Spanish, but relatively strong in Spanish word reading and comparable in passage comprehension? Remembering the grade level that the student is in and thinking about things like cross-linguistic transfer. So if you wanted to pause and discuss that at this moment, that might not be a bad idea. Or you could just keep listening. Questions you can ask with this kind of a framework. What are my students' literacy levels in level X? What are they in language Y? How bilingual or biliterate are my students? That is, you can ask the question is how balanced are their literacies in their languages? And does this vary by language background? To me, this is very important for dual language programs that actually serve native English speaking and native speaking populations of Spanish, Mandarin, or whatever the target language might be. You want to see if that bilingualism and biliteracy varies as a function of the language that's spoken at home. Do you see basically reverse patterns? That is, in the Spanish-English dual language program, do you see the Spanish speakers being high in Spanish vocabulary, but the English speakers being low in Spanish vocabulary, and vice versa for English vocabulary? And so what does that mean for assessing, for understanding how kids generally in the program are doing when you have these kind of bimodal distributions of performance as a function of home language background? And another question you can ask with the two monolinguals framework is, does any of this change over time? You can monitor performance in these different constructs, in these different languages over time. Problems with this framework, they're based on monolingual speakers. So those percentile rankings were comparing that bilingual student to monolingual performance in Spanish and in English. That's somewhat inherently unfair. That's because these tests are normed on monolingual speakers. The assessments don't exist in most languages other than Spanish and English. So if you've got a Mandarin English bilingual program, or even a Portuguese English bilingual program, this type of framework is more difficult to implement, at least from a standardized measure perspective. And this is the most common approach, if we're honest, in research and in education. Getting measures in one language and then the other is the most common. So the next framework is what's called the Common Underlying Proficiency Framework, and some people who have sort of studied bilingualism will know this was first put forward by a man named Jim Cummins, who said that, look, there are things that bilingual people know irrespective of the languages that they speak. So you can see up at the top, this is like a dual iceberg. It looks like two icebergs if you're out on the ocean looking out, but really it's just one big iceberg. There's just surface features of that iceberg that are different. So let's just say for the purposes of argument that L1 is Spanish and L2 is English, those two languages on the surface are different from each other. They have similar but different grammatical structures. The languages they are separate languages. But a Spanish-English bilingual student knows things irrespective of what language they speak or how proficient they are in either language. So for example, from a content perspective, you might know what photosynthesis is as a bilingual person because you learned it while you were studying science in the Dominican Republic before you came to the United States. So you've learned about photosynthesis. Now you're here in a US classroom in an English-only environment, and you're being asked to express your knowledge of photosynthesis, but now you're being asked to express it in English. That's going to be difficult. But the fact that you can't express it in English doesn't mean you don't have that knowledge. It just means that the surface features of English are precluding you at this moment in developmental time from expressing what you know about photosynthesis. So if you were asked to express that knowledge in Spanish, you wouldn't have any trouble doing that. So in that sense, assessing kids in languages in which they're not fully proficient, particularly when it comes to content knowledge, is a flawed premise. Another way that common underlying proficiency works is respect to what's often called the cross-linguistic transfer. So it's not just content knowledge, but it's linguistic knowledge. So that same student who went to school in the Dominican Republic and learned about photosynthesis also learned to read in Spanish. And so now that student knows what a B is, what the letter B is and the sound it makes, that student does not have to relearn that information when it comes to learning how to read in English because the B makes the same sound in English. So that knowledge transfers. It is a common underlying proficiency. No new learning need take place. You just need to make the insight that English and Spanish share some orthographic features. So that's that framework. And here's the way that it might play itself out. So here on the left, you have 6 pictures, and this is a vocabulary assessment that we often give to students. and we give this, you can do it with the two monolinguals framework. You can give this test in English, and then you can give a parallel test in Spanish, and you can get two different measures, or two different levels, of one of English and one of Spanish vocabulary, like we saw before. But the other way to do this would be to give it just once in both languages. So here it's a one-on-one assessment. So I would be sitting with you, the student, and I would point to number one. I would say, what is this? An ice cream cone. Number two, what is this? A cow. Number three, what is this? A toothbrush. 4, drum. 5, flashlight. 6, rocking chair. If the student gets it right, if they say those things, they get a 1, a score of 1. If they get it wrong, they get a score of 0. And then you just sum the ones for a raw score. So you can see the score sheet here on the right. Item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the English performance. In this case, the student knew ice cream, cow, and toothbrush. You can see they got a 1. They didn't know drum, flashlight, and rocking chair. They got a 0. So they have a total raw score in English of 3. Now, if we're thinking about a common underlying proficiency, you go back to that same assessment. So now you see the score sheet on the right. You have items 1 through 6. You have the initial English score. And now what you do is you re-administer the missed items, items 4, 5, and 6. You ask, what are those in Spanish? And then here you can see the student knew 4 and knew 5 in Spanish, did not know rocking chair in Spanish or in English. So does not get any credit for knowing what a rocking chair is. But as you can see, now you have an English raw score of 3, a Spanish raw score of 5, so an overall conceptual score, a common underlying proficiency score of 5, which is much higher than 3. So questions you can ask with the common underlying proficiency framework is, what are my students' English language and literacy levels? So that's a monolingual framework. How much does the other language add, Spanish or Mandarin or whatever? The English raw scores plus the Spanish or Mandarin raw scores gives you a better sense of the overall, in this case, vocabulary knowledge that the student is bringing. So that's useful. Problems with this framework is that they don't really give you necessarily an indicator of bilingualism or biliteracy. So it's inferior to the two monolinguals framework in that sense, because, for example, if our hypothetical student got all 6 items in English correct, then you would have no need to go back and re-administer in Spanish. So you have no idea if they know those words in Spanish. You now just have an indicator of English proficiency. So it's not ideal from that perspective in terms of knowing bilingualism and biliteracy. The third and final framework is the cross-linguistic framework. This views the bilingual as a linguistic whole, not as two monolinguals, but just as a linguistic person, a person who uses language, and language can be any language. This takes a developmental perspective. So unbalanced bilinguals, kids who are more proficient in one language than another, they will pull from their dominant language to make sense of their second language. They're going to do everything they can to take the literacy knowledge that they know and bring it to bear on the use and acquisition of the second language. But more balanced bilinguals are going to engage in what's called a fuller linguistic repertoire, sort of the strategic or aesthetic use of two languages to make sense of text, to express identity, and things like that. As Gino Diaz says, as bilinguals, we exist in a constant state of translation. We just don't like it. So that's an interesting quote, but it's true. Gino Diaz, as some of you may know, wrote The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and is one of the most sort of dynamic bilingual writers that's out there. He writes mostly in English, but Spanish is always infused into his prose. And so he's saying we as bilinguals, true bilinguals, exist in this state of translation all the time. So translation. One way to think about tapping a holistic biliteracy framework could be through translation. And I'm not sure. This is some research that I've done in the past with children, where we ask kids to translate. In this case, the languages are Spanish and English. In 2 ways, going from Spanish, translating into English, and then going from English, translating into Spanish. And here you have the actual assessment that we gave to kids. You just look on the left-hand side. Those are the items that the students looked at. So Spanish-English sentence level. Las plantas necesitan de una cierta cantidad de luz para sobrevivir. Students see that sentence, and their job is to translate that to English. Similarly, on the other side of the page, there's a list of English sentences. Animals must eat food to provide energy to their bodies. They have to translate. So what you see on the right, this translation is sort of an ideal translation that we were, a high-scoring, a high-performing student would produce. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you can see the tense. Like these tenses are all, there are 5 of them, and they map to the most common tenses used in academic texts in upper elementary and middle school. So having kids do this, go from one way to the other, from one language to the other, and translating gives you a sense of things, of how they can perform and use both of their languages at the same time. So questions you can ask this framework: are my students able to make meaning across languages? You can see how that might be the case in terms of that translation assignment. What language is stronger or more dominant? The translation clearly shows that. And can my students use both languages? How do my students use 2 languages to create meaning? So the nuances of translation are always kind of interesting to look at, and sort of how kids choose to do literal translations or might pull on idioms and things like that. And then can I use information across languages to teach broader concepts? So this gets to the concept of translanguaging, which is not a topic of this course, but is a topic of the next course, the Bilingualism, Second Language, and Literacy Acquisition. So this is something that you'll want to be thinking about in terms of kids being able to use languages sort of dynamically to make sense of text. Problems, they're difficult to assess. It's very challenging to use the translation assignments, and it's very difficult to score them. So how do you know when it's good? You know when it's good. It's hard to know sort of nuances of quality, however. And this perspective is at odds with the monolingual instructional principles at many dual language schools. That is, this sort of more of a strict separation of languages. So the idea of translanguaging is not exactly sort of welcomed in all dual language contexts, because in many cases we're trying to protect Spanish, and we don't want to let English in too much because we want to really elevate Spanish as much as possible. So that can be a challenge. And finally, questions to consider: which frameworks resonate most with you? Which frameworks are applied in your content area assessments, if any? And which frameworks are applied at the district and state level? Some of these answers I think are a little bit obvious, but it's worth thinking about and worth pondering, particularly in the context of the assignments that you'll be doing for this final module. Okay, that's all for this. Thank you very much, and good luck with the final assignment. Once that's in, congratulations, you've made it through this course. And I haven't read any of your stuff yet, but I am sure that I have enjoyed reading your reflections on foundations of dual language and bilingual education. Thank you.